The air in the grand hall felt thick and heavy, like a warm blanket you couldn't quite throw off. It was a special kind of quiet, not the empty quiet of an empty room, but a full one. Packed with hundreds of people all breathing the same air. They were rustling in their seats, soft sound of expensive coats brushing against one another, the crinkle of shiny programs being opened for the first time. It was the sound of anticipation. Every year, the city's most important music competition for young people was held here, and the hall was always filled with a mix of proud parents, serious music teachers, and curious members of the public who just appreciated a good show. They all came to see the best young musicians in the region, to witness the birth of a future star. Perhaps at the very center of all this attention, sitting alone under the bright, warm lights of the stage, was a grand piano. It wasn't just any piano. It was a Steinway, a name that meant something to everyone in that room. It was polished to a deep, dark mirror shine, so perfect you could see the lights above reflected in its black surface. It looked less like an instrument and more like a monument to a long and serious history of music. It seemed to be waiting patiently for someone worthy enough to bring its voice to life. The stage itself was vast and empty, making the piano look both powerful and a little lonely. Then a voice, smooth and calm, echoed through the hall from a speaker hidden somewhere in the ceiling. And now, performing next, we have a young lady from the north side of the city. A hush fell over the crowd. All the little whispers and rustlings stopped. Every head turned to watch the side of the stage where a small door was set into the heavy red curtains. This was the moment everyone was waiting for. They were ready to be impressed. They were expecting to see someone who looked like they belonged on that stage. Someone who carried themselves with the confidence of a prodigy. But when the girl appeared, a quiet wave of confusion seemed to pass through the front rows. She was a teenager, maybe 16 or so, with a quietness about her that made her seem smaller than she probably was. Her hair was pulled back in a simple way, and she wore a plain dress that, while clean and neat, was clearly not expensive. It didn't sparkle or flow. It was just a dress. She walked towards the center of the stage, her steps a little hesitant. Not with the bold stride of a performer who owned the room. She looked like a regular person who had accidentally wandered into a very important place in the audience. A man with a neatly trimmed gray beard leaned over to the woman next to him. He didn't speak. He just raised an eyebrow and gave a tiny, almost invisible nod towards the stage. The woman, who wore a string of pearls around her neck, understood perfectly. She pursed her lips and gave a small, tight shrug. It was a silent conversation that many others in the room were also having with their eyes. They had seen this before. A hopeful student who had practiced hard, but who just didn't have the look, the polish, the special something that separates the good from the great. The girl reached the piano, pulled out the adjustable bench. The sound of its metal legs scraping softly against the wooden stage was the only noise in the entire hall. It felt too loud, too real. She sat down, smoothing her dress under her legs. Her movements were careful, a little stiff. She looked at the keys, then up at the vast, dark room beyond the bright lights. It was hard to see faces, just a sea of dark shapes. It must have felt like staring into a huge, empty cave. She placed her fingers on the keys, getting a feel for them, and took a deep, quiet breath. It was a breath meant to calm her nerves, a breath to prepare for the difficult task ahead. It was in that moment of silence, just before she was about to play, that the sound came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was a laugh. A short, sharp chuckle from a group of young men sitting near the back. They were probably friends of another contestant, bored and waiting for their turn. To them, the girl on stage was just part of the show, a figure who looked a little out of place. Their laugh was a thoughtless, careless reaction. It was the kind of sound that can be easily ignored in a noisy crowd, but in a silent hall, it was as sharp as a shard of glass. The girl's shoulders, which had been slightly hunched over the keyboard, tensed up. Her fingers, which had been resting lightly on the ivory keys, froze. It was a tiny, almost invisible reaction, but it was there. Anyone who was watching closely could see it. The laugh had found its target. It was a sound of dismissal, a quiet judgment that said, "You don't belong here." The laugh was quickly swallowed by the hall's silence again, but it didn't disappear. It hung in the air, echoing in the quiet corners of the girl's mind. She could feel a hot prickle on the back of her neck. She had been so focused on the music, on the hundreds of notes she had to play perfectly, that she wasn't prepared for this. She had practiced for months, for hours every day. Her fingers growing sore and her mind tired with the effort of memorizing the complex piece. But she hadn't practiced for this. She hadn't practiced for the feeling of being laughed at. Her eyes dropped from the dark audience and fell upon the sheet music sitting on the piano stand. The notes were black and crowded on the page, a dense forest of little symbols that only she could decipher. It was a piece by Liszt, a composer known for writing music that was as difficult as it was beautiful. It was a piece designed to show off, to dazzle the audience with speed and power. It was a test of fire, and she knew she was being judged on every single note. The thought of playing it now, with the ghost of that laugh still in the air, felt impossible. The music suddenly seemed like a mountain. She didn't have the strength to climb. She could feel her heart beating a little faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. A part of her wanted to just stand up and walk away, to run off the stage and hide in the quiet darkness backstage. No one would blame her, not really. They would just shake their heads and say she wasn't ready. But another part of her, a deeper, quieter part, refused to move. It was the part of her that loved the music, the part that had found joy in the challenge of mastering this difficult piece. It was the part that knew she had earned her place on this stage, not because of a fancy dress or a confident walk, but because of the hours she had spent alone in a room with this piano. Slowly, very slowly, she let out the breath she had been holding. It was a shaky breath, but it was a start. She straightened her back just a little, lifting her chin. She wasn't looking at the audience anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the music, on the first note of the piece. She was trying to build a wall around herself, a small, quiet space where only she and the piano existed. She was trying to find the courage to begin, to prove the laugh wrong, to show everyone that she was more than what they saw. The entire hall waited, holding its collective breath, to see what she would do next. The silence was no longer anticipatory. It was charged with a new and unexpected tension. For a long moment, the only thing that moved in the entire hall was the dust motes dancing in the bright stage lights. The girl sat frozen, her hands hovering just above the keys, a statue carved from doubt. The silence that followed the careless laugh was a heavy thing, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. But then something inside her shifted. It was like a tiny gear clicking into place. She let out another breath, this one slower and more deliberate than the last. It was as if she were physically pushing the weight of the room off of her. Her focus narrowed, the blurry sea of faces and the audience fading away until all that was left was the black and white of the keys and the black ink of the sheet music. Her fingers, which had been stiff with tension, finally came to rest on the ivory. They settled into the starting position for the Liszt piece, a complex formation that felt both familiar and foreign. She could feel the slight vibration of the strings through the wood, a silent promise of the sound to come. With one final silent prayer to herself, she began. The first notes that rang out were clear and sharp. Each one was struck with a careful precision, a testament to the hundreds of hours she had spent practicing. The melody, a whirlwind of intricate patterns, started to take shape. It was technically perfect. Every note was in its place. Every rhythm was exact. She was playing it exactly as it was written on the page, exactly as her teacher had drilled her to do. For the first minute, a sense of relief washed over her. She was doing it. She was proving them wrong. The notes were correct. The passage was clean. She was navigating the storm of the music without making a single mistake. But as the piece continued, strange feeling began to creep in. It was a hollowness. The music was there, but it felt empty. It was like looking at a beautiful painting with all the color drained out, leaving only the lines. She was so focused on not messing up, on hitting every single note with flawless accuracy, that she had forgotten the most important part. She had forgotten to feel it. Her fingers were doing the work, but her heart wasn't in it. She was a machine, perfectly executing a set of instructions. And the music, despite its complexity, sounded lifeless. She could feel it. She was sure the audience could feel it too. The initial tension in the room had been replaced by a kind of polite indifference. People were listening, but they weren't being moved. The man with the gray beard had settled back in his seat, his expression unimpressed. The woman with the pearls was studying her program, as if the music on stage was merely a background distraction to her reading. The quiet confidence she had tried to build for herself was crumbling. Playing it safe wasn't working. It was just proving the silent judgment that she was competent but not special. The music on the page grew more demanding. The notes came faster, a torrent of sound that required not just precision, but a kind of fearless aggression. This was the part of the piece that was meant to be a showstopper, a moment of pure musical power. Her teacher had always told her, you have to attack the keys here. You have to make them sing with passion. But passion was the one thing she was lacking. She was afraid. Afraid of missing a note, afraid of another sound from the audience, afraid of failing completely. Her fingers, which had been so sure just moments before, began to feel clumsy. They were moving too fast, her mind struggling to keep up with the commands her eyes were reading from the page. It was like trying to run at full speed down a dark, unfamiliar path. She knew a stumble was coming. She could feel it in the growing panic in her chest, in the way her breath was catching in her throat. And then it happened. In a blur of flying fingers, her right hand stumbled. It was a small mistake, a misjudgment of a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. Instead of landing on the correct key, her finger slipped and hit the one next to it. The sound that came out was not part of the beautiful, complex melody. It was a jarring, discordant clang, a wrong note. A mistake so loud and so out of place that it cut through the music like a siren. The sound hung in the air, clear and sharp. Everything stopped. Her hands froze midair, caught in the act of the crime. The music died instantly, leaving a void that was instantly filled with a collective audible gasp from the audience. It was a sound of shock, of sympathy, and of a little bit of cruel satisfaction from a few corners. The whispers that had been quiet before now erupted into a buzz, like a disturbed beehive. She could hear snippets of them carried on the air. Oh dear, that's a shame. I knew it. The heat that had been prickling her neck before now felt like a full-on fire, burning her cheeks. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard, she thought it might burst. The judges, who had been watching with neutral expressions, now leaned forward in their seats. Their faces were a mixture of disappointment and pity. One of them, a stern-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun, was already making a note on her paper. The verdict was in. It was over. She had failed. Not just a little, but spectacularly. The one thing she had feared most had happened in front of all these people. The laughter from before, which had seemed so small, now felt like a deafening roar in her ears. It was as if the entire world was laughing at her, pointing and whispering about the girl who dared to dream she could play with the big kids. Every insecurity she had ever had about herself, about her simple clothes and her quiet background, came rushing back at her all at once. They were right. She didn't belong here. Her vision started to blur, the black notes on the page swimming together into an unreadable mess. A hot, stinging feeling rose behind her eyes. She wanted to cry. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the heavy red curtains to just swallow her whole. Her hands were still frozen over the keys, trembling slightly. The audience was waiting, watching to see what she would do. Would she run? Would she try to start again, only to fail once more? Every second of silence felt like an eternity, a public humiliation that was being stretched out for everyone to see. The weight of their stares, their pity, their judgment, was crushing her. She was a small, broken thing on a very big stage, and the whole world was watching her fall apart. The silence that followed the jarring, wrong note was a living thing. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. It pressed down on the girl on the stage, a physical force that seemed to suck the air right out of her lungs. Her hands remained frozen, hovering over the keys like two pale, frightened birds. In that moment, time seemed to stretch and warp. A second felt like a minute, and a minute felt like an hour. She was acutely aware of every tiny detail, the way the stage lights made the polished wood of the piano gleam, the faint smell of dust an old velvet in the air, the frantic, hopeless beating of her own heart against her ribs like a trapped bird. The audience was a single, breathing entity of pity and judgment. She could feel their collective gaze on her, 1,000 tiny needles pricking at her skin. She didn't have to look up to know what was happening. The man with the gray beard was probably shaking his head slowly, a sad, knowing look on his face. The woman with the pearls had likely put her program down, her theatrical sigh of disappointment barely audible. The judges were a panel of gods, and they had just passed their final verdict. Their pens were scratching on paper, notating her failure with a final, permanent mark. The whispers from the back, the careless laughter that had started this whole nightmare, now felt like a chorus of triumph. They had been right all along. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run, to just stand up, push the bench back with a scrape of wood against wood, and flee. To escape the suffocating weight of their stares and hide in the comforting darkness backstage. She could picture it so clearly, the heavy red curtain swinging shut behind her, blotting out the lights and the faces, leaving her alone with her shame. No one would blame her. It was the expected thing to do. It was the sensible thing to do. To stay here, under this microscope, was a special kind of torture, but her legs wouldn't move. They felt as heavy as lead, rooted to the floor. Her feet seemed to have grown into the stage itself. She was a statue, a monument to failure, and she was stuck there for all to see. Her mind was a chaotic storm of thoughts, a whirlwind of panic and despair. I ruined it. A voice inside her head shrieked. It's all over. Everyone is laughing at me. I should never have come up here. Another voice, quieter but more cruel, whispered, You see? You were never good enough. You were just pretending. Her gaze was locked on the sheet music, but the notes were no longer recognizable. They were just black squiggles on a white page, a foreign language she had suddenly forgotten how to read. The Liszt piece, her mountain to climb, had crumbled into a pile of rubble, and she was buried underneath it. She had poured months of her life into learning it, sacrificing time with friends and time for herself, all for this one moment. And in one clumsy slip of a finger, it had all turned to dust. She slowly, very slowly, began to lower her hands. They were trembling so badly it was a wonder they didn't just fall off her wrists. She brought them down into her lap, clutching them together as if she were trying to hold herself together. She closed her eyes. It was a desperate attempt to shut it all out, to make the world disappear. If she couldn't see them, maybe they couldn't see her. But it didn't work. The darkness behind her eyelids was even worse. It was a screen where her failure played on a loop, the wrong note echoing over and over again, getting louder and more distorted each time. In that suffocating darkness, a different kind of thought began to form. It was so quiet at first that she almost missed it, a tiny whisper in the middle of a hurricane. It wasn't a thought about the music, or the competition, or what the audience was thinking. It was a question. A simple, childlike question that cut through all the noise. The question hung there in the darkness of her mind. Afraid of what? Failing? She had already failed. Being laughed at? That had already happened. What was left to be afraid of? The worst had already come to pass. She had stumbled, she had been heard, and she had been judged. The disaster was complete. And yet she was still here. The world hadn't ended. The roof hadn't caved in. She was just a girl, sitting at a piano in a silent room. Another thought followed, this one a little stronger. This isn't you, she thought about the hours she had spent practicing. Not just this difficult piece, but all music. She thought about the simple melodies she would play for herself late at night, just for the joy of it. She thought about the way music could make her feel happy or sad or peaceful, a language that didn't need any words. The Liszt piece wasn't her language. It was someone else's. It was a language of showing off, of technical fireworks, of proving you were the best. It was a language she had learned to speak. But it wasn't the one that was in her heart. She had been so desperate to win their approval, to prove the laughter wrong, that she had forgotten why she even loved to play in the first place. She had been trying to be someone she wasn't, and the music had known it. The wrong note wasn't just a mistake. It was a confession. It was the truth breaking through the perfect, polished lie. A strange sense of calm began to settle over her. The frantic panic in her chest started to quiet down. The heat in her cheeks began to cool. It was as if by accepting her failure, by admitting to herself that it was all over, she had been set free. There was nothing left to lose. She had already hit rock bottom, and it wasn't as scary as she had imagined. In fact, there was a certain kind of peace down here. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The bright lights of the stage didn't seem so harsh anymore. She looked down at her hands, still clenched tightly in her lap. She uncurled her fingers one by one. They were still trembling, but now it felt less like fear and more like anticipation. A new idea was beginning to form in her mind. A crazy, reckless, wonderful idea. Her eyes moved from her lap to the sheet music still sitting on the piano. The black notes stared back at her, a symbol of her failure, a monument to the person she was trying to be. She looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached out with her right hand. Her fingers, still a little shaky, touched the edge of the thick paper. The audience watched, completely still, their curiosity piqued. What was she doing? Was she going to try again? She didn't try again. Instead, she took hold of the cover of the heavy music book. And then she closed it. The soft thud of the cover falling shut was the only sound in the hall. It was a quiet sound, but it felt louder than a gunshot. It was the sound of a door closing, a final, decisive act. A murmur rippled through the audience. It was a sound of pure confusion. The judges looked up from their papers, their expressions puzzled. The man with the gray beard leaned forward again, his brow furrowed. The girl had just taken away her only map, her only guide. She was on the stage, at the piano, with no music to play. It made no sense. But the girl on the stage felt a sense of clarity she had never experienced before. By closing the book, she had closed the door on their expectations, on the pressure, on the person she was supposed to be. She was no longer a contestant in a competition. She was just a girl at a piano. She placed her hands back on the keys, but this time they felt different. They weren't the careful, hesitant hands of a student trying to please her teachers. They were her hands. The keys were no longer a test to be passed, but a friend she hadn't talked to in a while. She looked out at the dark room not as a judge to be won over, but as a listener. She was going to tell them a story, not the story written by a long-dead composer, but her own story. A story of a girl who was scared, who stumbled, who was laughed at, and who, in the end, found a different kind of courage. She took one last deep breath, the air filling her lungs not with fear, but with purpose. And then she began to play. The first sound to break the profound silence was not a grand, confident chord, but a single soft note. It hung in the air, fragile and alone, like a question asked in an empty room. It was a note full of hesitation, a sound that mirrored the girl's own inner state just moments before. The audience, which had been leaning forward in a state of collective confusion, now found itself holding its breath. This was not the list. This was not anything they recognized from the program. It was something else entirely. The girl's fingers, which had been trembling with fear, now moved with a new kind of purpose. They were not the precise mechanical movements of a student trying to impress. They were slower, more deliberate, as if she were feeling her way through a familiar path in the dark. The single note was followed by another, and then another, slowly weaving together a simple, haunting melody. It was not a technically complex tune. There were no dizzying runs or thunderous chords. In fact, to a trained ear, it might have even sounded a little amateurish, a little rough around the edges. But it had something the Liszt performance had completely lacked. It had a soul. The melody was tinged with a deep, quiet sadness. The kind of sadness that doesn't cry out loud, but instead sits quietly in the corner of your heart. It was the sound of loneliness, of feeling small and out of place. It was the sound of walking onto a huge stage and feeling like you don't belong. The audience, which had been a sea of judgmental faces, began to change. The furrowed brows of confusion started to soften. The whispers died completely. People were no longer watching a competition. They were listening to a confession. As the melody continued, it began to change. The simple, sad notes started to grow a little stronger, a little more insistent. A new rhythm crept in, a sense of frustration and urgency. The pace quickened slightly, the harmony becoming more dissonant, clashing in a way that was uncomfortable but strangely compelling. This was the sound of the struggle. It was the sound of hours of practice, of fingers cramping and a mind growing tired. It was the sound of trying so hard to be perfect, to fit into a mold that was never made for you. The girl's body began to move with the music now. Her shoulders swayed slightly, her head nodding with the rhythm. She was no longer a statue at the piano. She was a part of it, a conduit for the story the music was telling. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of concentration and emotion. She was no longer in the grand hall with its hundreds of people. She was lost in her own world, a world of black and white keys and the feelings they could create. The man with the gray beard sat completely still, his program forgotten on the floor beside his seat. He had heard hundreds, maybe thousands of young pianists in his lifetime. He had heard flawless performances that left him cold, and technically flawed ones that had moved him to tears. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was one of those moments. This was not about playing the right notes. This was about telling the truth. The woman with the pearls had stopped looking at her program. Her hand was resting on her chest, a gesture of unconscious empathy. The hard, critical look in her eyes had been replaced by one of deep, human connection. She was no longer judging a contestant. She was feeling the story of a young girl, and it reminded her of her own struggles, her own moments of feeling misunderstood. The music continued to build, becoming more and more agitated. The notes were sharper now, the rhythm more frantic. It was the sound of panic, of the pressure mounting, of the fear of failure closing in. The melody was becoming more and more chaotic, a whirlwind of sound that was threatening to spin out of control. The audience was on the edge of their seats, completely captivated. They could feel the tension, the anxiety, the desperate fight to hold it all together. And then it happened. In the middle of a particularly frantic passage, a jarring, dissonant chord rang out. It was the same kind of ugly, wrong sound that had ended her Liszt performance. But this time it was different. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. It was the musical equivalent of a stumble, a fall, a moment of complete and utter failure. The sound was shocking, but it was also the heart of the story. It was the sound of the wrong note, the sound of the gasp from the audience, the sound of the world crashing down. The jarring chord hung in the air for a moment, a stark reminder of the disaster. But then, something incredible happened. Instead of stopping, the girl did not falter. She let the dissonance fade, and from the quiet that followed, a new melody began to emerge. It was a variation of the simple, sad theme from the beginning, but it was different now. It was softer, but it was not weak. It was quiet, but it was not hesitant. It was a melody of acceptance, of picking yourself up after you have fallen. It was the sound of realizing that failure is not the end. The music began to grow again, but this time it was not a frantic, panicked growth. It was a slow, steady, powerful rise. The harmony became richer, more hopeful. The melody began to soar, climbing higher and higher, filled with a quiet strength and a newfound sense of peace. It was the sound of finding your own voice, of letting go of the need to be perfect and just being yourself. It was the sound of courage, not the loud, boisterous kind, but the quiet, resilient kind that is born from facing your deepest fears. The girl's face, which had been a mask of intense concentration, softened. A small, gentle smile played on her lips. She was no longer fighting the music. She was flowing with it. Her fingers danced across the keys with a grace and freedom that had been completely absent before. She was not just playing the piano. She was having a conversation with it, and the entire hall was listening in. The story was coming to a close now. The soaring melody began to gentle, the powerful chords softening into a more peaceful, resolved harmony. The music was like a person who had been through a storm and had now found a safe harbor. It was a sound of healing, of understanding, of coming home to oneself. Finally, the melody returned to the single, soft note that had started it all. It was the same note, but it felt completely different now. It was no longer a question. It was an answer. It hung in the air for a long moment, pure and clear, a final, perfect statement. And then silence. The silence that followed was different from any other silence that night. It was not a silence of confusion or pity or judgment. It was a silence of awe. It was a deep, reverent, quiet, a shared moment of profound emotion. No one moved. No one spoke. The air was thick with the feeling of the story they had just been told. Every single person in that hall, from the stern judges to the bored teenagers in the back, had been transported. They had all felt the girl's fear, her struggle, her fall, and her incredible rise. They had forgotten about the competition, about the technical scores, about who was supposed to win. They had just witnessed something real, something raw, something beautifully, imperfectly human. And in that moment of shared silence, they were all connected, not as an audience and a performer, but as human beings who had all, at some point in their lives, stumbled and found the strength to stand back up. The final single note faded into the air, but its echo seemed to remain, vibrating in the hearts of everyone listening. The silence that followed was not the awkward, waiting silence of before. It was a thick, heavy blanket of shared emotion, a sacred space where no one dared to breathe, let alone speak. On the stage, the girl sat with her hands resting in her lap, her head bowed. The music was gone, but she was still living inside it, her body slowly coming down from the high of pure, unfiltered expression. She was not thinking about the audience or the judges. She was not thinking about winning or losing. She was just feeling the quiet hum of the piano and the steady beat of her own heart. A rhythm that was calm and sure for the first time all night. Then a sound broke the spell. It was a single, sharp clap. It came from a man sitting in the third row, a music teacher who had spent his entire life trying to teach his students the technical side of music, but had always secretly hoped they would find the truth within it. He was not clapping out of politeness. He was clapping because he had just been reminded why music mattered at all. His clap was a spark in a room full of dry tinder. Instantly, another clap joined his, then another and another. It was not a slow, hesitant build. It was an explosion. The entire hall seemed to erupt at once. The sound was deafening, a roaring wave of approval that washed over the stage and crashed against the high ceilings. It was not the polite, measured applause you give to a competent performance. It was raw, emotional, and unrestrained. It was the sound of 100 hearts, all beating in the same rhythm of awe and admiration. One by one, people began to rise from their seats. It started with a few, then spread like a ripple across a pond until the entire hall was on its feet. The man with the gray beard was standing, his hands clapping together with a force that surprised him, a huge, genuine smile on his face. The woman with the pearls was on her feet too, single tear tracing a path down her cheek, her program forgotten on the floor. Even the group of young men in the back were on their feet, their faces no longer bored or mocking, but filled with a wide-eyed respect. They had come to laugh at a girl who didn't fit in, and they were leaving as witnesses to a moment of pure, unadulterated genius. On the stage, the girl slowly lifted her head. The sound finally penetrated her peaceful bubble, and she looked out at the sea of standing, clapping people. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. She saw the faces no longer a blur of judgment, but a collection of individual expressions of joy and wonder. She saw the tears, the smiles, the looks of pure, unfiltered emotion. She saw that they were not clapping for a flawless performance. They were clapping for her courage, for her vulnerability, for the beautiful, imperfect truth she had shared with them. A single tear, one of release and not of sadness, welled up in her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just let it fall. She slowly rose from the piano bench and gave a small, awkward bow. It wasn't the polished, practiced bow of a seasoned performer. It was a humble, heartfelt gesture of gratitude. As she straightened up, she looked towards the judges' table. She expected to see them still marking their papers, their expressions unreadable. But they were all standing too. The stern woman with the tight bun, was looking at her with an expression of deep, profound respect. She gave the girl a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture that said more than any score or any prize ever could. It was the recognition of a fellow artist, acknowledgement that what she had just witnessed was something rare and special. The girl looked back at the piano, at the closed book of music sitting on the stand. It was no longer a symbol of her failure, but a reminder of the choice she had made. The choice to let go of who she was supposed to be and to embrace who she truly was. She had not won the competition. In fact, in the eyes of the traditional scoring, she had probably come in last. She had broken the rules, she had played her own music, and she had made a mistake on purpose. But as she stood there, bathed in the warm light of the stage and the even warmer light of the audience's love, she knew she had won something far more important. She had won her own soul back. The applause continued for a long time, a thundering roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. The girl stood there for as long as she could, soaking it all in, trying to commit every second to memory. Then she turned and walked towards the side of the stage. As she disappeared behind the heavy red curtains, the applause seemed to grow even louder. A final, triumphant send-off for the girl who had faced laughter and had responded with a song that stunned the world. Backstage, the noise from the hall was muffled, a distant, comforting roar. The air was cooler here. The familiar smell of dust and old wood was a welcome anchor in the sea of emotions she was feeling. A stagehand, a gruff man who had seen 1,000 performers come and go, gave her a small, genuine smile and a thumbs up as she walked past. She found a quiet corner and leaned against the wall, her legs feeling suddenly weak. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was starting to fade. Leaving behind a beautiful, exhausted calm, she thought about her journey to this stage. She thought about the long hours of practice, the frustration, the self-doubt. She thought about the simple joy of playing her own music, alone in her room, where no one could judge her. She had lost that joy somewhere along the way, lost it in the pressure to compete, to win, to be the best. But tonight, she had found it again. She had found it in the most unexpected of places, in the middle of her biggest failure. By letting go of the need to be perfect, she had found a way to be truly great. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if this moment would lead to anything, if she would get offers to play at other venues, if she would become famous. And as she stood there in the quiet darkness, she realized she didn't care. The prize was not the applause or the recognition. The prize was the music itself. The prize was the feeling of being true to herself, of sharing a piece of her heart with the world, and having it received with so much love. The muffled roar from the hall began to subside, and she could hear the sounds of people starting to leave, their excited chatter spilling into the hallway. She knew she would have to go out there eventually, face her parents, her teacher, and the questions that would surely come. But for now, she was content to just be alone with her thoughts, to savor the quiet after the storm. She had walked onto that stage a scared, insecure girl, desperate for the approval of others. She was walking off at a musician, an artist, a storyteller. She had faced the laughter, and in doing so, she had found her own voice. And that was a prize that no one could ever take away from her.